Welcome to week one. We start with the fundamental question: how did it all start? Now, if only it were that easy. However, there were a lot of things that had to happen before it would all come together and enable that first message to be sent out via Morse code and the Morse code key. We kind of mentioned this in our introductory video. We need electricity. More importantly, electricity needs to be created and stored in a way that we can use it when we want it. So who was responsible for this? Let's talk about the, pardon the pun, key players here. We're going to step way back to 1600 roughly, and a gentleman named William Gilbert who described the process of what he called electrification. The term electricity is actually from Greek. It's a Greek word from for amber. Essentially, the Greeks figured out way back in about 600 BC that if you rub amber, it becomes charged with static electricity. They didn't know what that was at the time, but William Gilbert began to kind of put two and two together. So he called what was being created electricity. A gentleman named Otto van Guericke, 1660, and forgive me if you guys are really good at word pronunciation or name pronunciation. I am terrible with names, so I'm sure I'm going to butcher many of these names as we go on. Anyway, Otto, I'll use his first name, he created the first machine that could create static electricity. It evolved into what we now know as the Van de Graaff generator. You've probably seen this in the science fiction movies and science shows where there's that big silver ball and it gets charged up and you can take your hand and hold it over it and these bolts of static electricity come to your hand and generally don't hurt. In 1670, Robert Boyle came up with the idea that there were things that cause attraction and repulsion and they're mutual and that electricity can be transmitted through a vacuum. There's a whole bunch of things that happened with Boyle's work, but we're summarizing it all up in these basic concepts. And then Stephen Gray, about 20 years later, he was known as the father of electricity. He distinguished the difference between conductors and non-conductors. And then we fast forward to 1733, and C.F. Dufay discovered or realized that there are two types of electricity. Moving along, I won't even try to pronounce these names. I'll just say Ewald and Peter created what's known as the Leyden jar, which was a type of capacitor for electrical energy. Now, capacitors, if you've studied anything about electricity or electrical components, are storage devices. They don't store for long necessarily, but they do store. Now, that's important because now we have a gentleman by the name of Ebenezer Kingsley and some unknown person named Benjamin Franklin around 1750 who figured out to name these two different charges that were figured out before as positive and negative. Now, Benjamin Franklin, the reason I was joking about being an unknown, actually it was Ebenezer who was kind of unknown. He didn't really advertise himself well, but Ben Franklin was really good at self-promotion. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. But he knew how to promote himself, and as such, he became much more well known for his work. So in 1748, Ben coined the term battery, which described glass plates that he'd been charging. There's a video later on that coming up that you can watch. I'll show you a screenshot from it in a moment, and it's in the additional materials that you can watch on the history of electricity to learn why did Benjamin Franklin call it a battery. Luigi Galvani demonstrated that nerve impulses in our bodies were based on electrical basis, or bias, if you will, which also drove the invention work done by later inventors. And then Alessandro Volta invented the voltaic pile and discovered the first practical ways of generating electricity. And then Daniel Cell in 1836 created the Daniel cell, he named it after himself, isn't that clever, which held electricity longer than the voltaic pile. It produced 1.1 volts. Now there's something we're going to notice here that you might be picking up on things here. Volta, Cell, Galvani, those names became labels that we've applied to components that are used in electrical work. The battery cell, volt, and the galvanic response. So just a few names that have kind of popped up. If you get into electrical work, you'll begin to recognize them. Many others, again, where this is a high-level overview, have contributed to the development of all the components which drive the telecommunications revolution. So now we kind of move into where we're ready to start playing around with Morse code. What is Morse code? It's simply described as a method or a way of transmitting information in a series of off and on tones or lights, blinking lights, or clicks that can be received by someone trained in understanding the code and make sense out of it. In 1836, Samuel F. B. Morse, Joseph Henry, and Alfred Vail worked together to develop the electrical telegraph system. Morse, of course, is the famous name, again, who is better at self-promotion. Generally, those who are good at getting the word out generally have the history attributed to them. The system was, essentially, it's a series of pulses of electrical current, which they were sending along wires, which controlled a magnet, an electromagnet, that was located at the receiving end of the wire. They developed this code as a way to transmit natural language only using these pulses, these magnetic on and off clicks, and the silence between them. So by default, what Morse was developing along with Henry and Vail, they developed the forerunner to what is now known as the modern International Morse Code. Meantime, over in England, a gentleman named William Cooke and another gentleman named Charles Wheatstone were in 1837 developing an electrical telegraph that used electromagnetics as well. Their system was a little bit actually kind of more sophisticated because it actually used pointing needles that rotated above an alphabetical chart on a board of some kind that indicated the letters that were being sent. So it sort of did the conversion for you. When a signal was sent that meant the letter A, the little pointer pointed to the letter A. It's pretty cool. And then in 1841, they actually invented a telegraph that printed the letters. The problem was it worked well, but they couldn't find anybody to buy it. And so it sort of like just disappeared into the history books. Back in the USA, though, Morse code was developed so that operators could translate these messages and convert them into text messages. They were actually now punching holes on a piece of paper tape. When Morse began this work, he really wanted to only transmit numbers or numerals and use a dictionary to look up each word according to the number it had been sent. Now think about this. So you send the number 432. All right. So now someone goes to a book and looks up 432, and that word means cow. All right. So, you could have a message that says the cow crossed the road. You're going to end up sending just probably the cow across the road, 5 sets of numbers, 5 numbers, and then someone sat down and figured out what they meant. Vail kind of thought, this is interesting, but a lot of extra work. Why don't we enhance the code so we could actually send all the letters and characters so it could be used a little bit more generically, because anticipating that you can't have a book with every word with a number associated with it, this seemed to be more futuristic or more future thinking, and he was right. So he sat down, looked at some local newspaper printing places. I actually went in and back in the day when they used to do newspapers with the old printing presses, there were drawers full of letter type, individual letters made of lead, and they were the little symbols. And typesetters would actually take the letters and assemble words in a big plate, if you will, which was then used to print the newspaper. So the printers of papers and books knew the greater frequency of letters, like the letter E is the most frequent letter in the English language that is used. So when Vail went and started counting the number of letters, E's and A's and B's and C's in the drawers of the typesetters, he immediately could figure out which were the letters that were used more. And so doing that, he was able to give those more frequently used letters a shorter code, and the less frequently used letters a longer code. So essentially they were dots and the longer ones were dashes, and the combination of dots and dashes were assigned to these shorter sequences. So here's a screen view of the Morse code. You're not expected to memorize this, although if you'd like to, go for it. I actually did when I got my ham radio license many years ago. It is no longer required for an amateur radio license. But if you look at the letter E, it's a single dot. If you look at the letter T, it is a single dash. Look at the letter Y, which is not frequently used. It's a dash dot dash dash. Other letters that aren't frequently used, J dot dash dash dash. or as they like to use it in the terms of radio, did-ah, or dit, or da, instead of dot and dash. So this is the Morse code. This is a modern version of Morse code. There are actually multiple versions out there when it was first invented. There was a maritime version, there was a railroad version, there were radio, we haven't gotten to radio yet, but we'll get there. So they eventually started to try to compile these all into a single type of international Morse code, which make it a little easier for everybody to understand each other. But that's the Morse code. So we have a code key, we have the Morse code, we're all set. We need to send a message, right? So Morse worked with a team of people, and they actually strung wires from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and then they sent the first message on Morse code. So now we've invented this device which allows you to send information for all purposes instantaneously, speed of light, if you will, or speed of electricity through copper. And about the same time this was all happening, the Civil War was starting to come about. It was a very difficult time. Abraham Lincoln was the first American president, or first president, first leader, world leader, in fact, who was able to communicate on the spot with his officers in the battlefield. Now, first off, it's important to recognize, do you have a president who's able to be the kind of military leader and have the kind of military knowledge or whatever is necessary to guide his troops directly like that on the battlefield? History is fraught with examples of national leaders who were not in a good place to do that, but they tried. Lincoln, however, had, I think, the wisdom and foresight, one, to have good military leaders, and secondarily understood that he needed to communicate with them. Now, he was communicating with his top officers, not obviously someone directly down in the trenches. They actually installed a telegraph office at the White House, enabled him to actually monitor battlefield reports, let him understand and develop real-time strategy. He could deliver this information to his leaders. There was a huge benefit here to the Union Army because the Confederate Army was at a massive disadvantage because they didn't have the technological or industrial abilities to conduct such large-scale communication campaigns. Yes, they had telegraph between key cities, but they didn't have the ability to get telegraph further out into the field. More importantly, the Union controlled most of the railroad lines that were critical in the war, with some exceptions, and the telegraph lines were strung along the railroad right-of-ways because it was a beautiful way. You just cut through the woods, and you put the poles up, and you put the lines up, and now you're communicating. In 1861, the Union Army actually established what was known as the U.S. Military Telegraph Corps, led by a young railroad man by the name of Andrew Carnegie. Those of you who are history buffs are going to recognize the name Carnegie because he was amazingly involved in steel and industrial development and the Industrial Revolution. But at the time he was a railroad man, which was his true calling, and he created this, and in the next year alone his organization trained over 1,200 telegraph operators, and they put out 4,000 miles of telegraph wire and sent over 1 million messages from the battlefield. So you're now going to get an idea of how important instantaneous communications is becoming. The nation's beginning to have the ability to communicate with each other on an instantaneous basis, aside from running from the telegraph office to the receiver who's going to read the message, instead of taking hours, days, weeks, or months for information to flow from one point to another. It's happening real time. So, from the key to the phone, the telegraph has had a huge impact on the country, and rapidly, I mean in a matter of years, the ability for communications, timely communications, accurate communications, just ramped up from the beginning of the United States and other countries who had relied upon carriers and letter posts and verbal messaging, now had the ability through the telegraph key to send this instantaneous information. It really started to reshape how countries and society evolved. Many people worked on the improvement process of the concept of the telegraph, which led to the invention of the telephone, which we'll talk about in part 2 next time.